This video will look at the differences between ABC, which is activity-based costing, and those traditional costing methods that we had used with predetermined overhead rates. We are going to be looking at one of the problems on the worksheet, and the problem states the following estimated overhead cost information is available for Herbert Love Corporation. And it lists out our activities as being purchasing, receiving, machine setups, and quality control. Our allocation bases would be number of purchase orders, number of shipments received, number of setups, and number of inspections. And it lists our overhead costs for each activity. So we have 400,000, 100,000, 300,000, and 100,000. Now during the year, we expect to have 8,000 purchase orders, 2,500 shipments received, 4,000 machine setups, and 70,500 inspections, and 10,000 direct labor hours. So this is the information that we have on this particular problem. The first question I want to look at is under the traditional costing, and this is what we had done in those previous chapters in 19 and 20, was traditional costing. We're going to use direct labor hours. What is our predetermined overhead rate? Now to find that predetermined overhead rate, we need to know what our total overhead costs are. So what we are going to do here is we are going to find what our overhead costs actually are. So we're going to take the 400,000 plus the 100,000 plus the 300,000 plus the 100,000, add all of that up, and what we find is we have 900,000 in total overhead. And we are going to base our traditional amounts on these 10,000 direct labor hours, because that's what we would traditionally have our overhead based on. We would look at the total estimated overhead cost. We would divide it by our activity drivers, which up to this point have been direct labor hours, direct labor dollars, or machine hours are some of the things that we have used. So in doing this traditional method, remember that predetermined overhead rate is that total overhead amount divided by what we are estimating that driver amount to be. So in this case, we would have that 900,000, and then it would be divided by those 10,000 hours that we have. And so we would be basing, we would be basing what we have here on these total numbers underneath that traditional system. And that would give us, I'm guessing, around $90 per direct labor hour. And that's using that traditional system. The next one, and what the problem's really asking, is to find your cost allocation rates for each activity. So what this is saying is we would look at what the cost is for each activity. So for purchasing, our overhead cost is estimated to be $400,000, and our driver, or the allocation base, is the number of purchase orders. So we would look and find that we have 8,000 purchase orders that are going to be issued for the year, and so what we are expecting is it to cost us $50 per purchase order. For the receiving department, or receiving activity, we are expecting $100,000 in overhead cost for that, and the allocation base is number of shipments received, and we are expecting 25,000 shipments to be received this year, and so that is going to be a cost of $4 per shipment received. In our machine setup is another activity that we are going to be looking at, and our estimated overhead cost here is $300,000. It is our allocation base and driver is number of setups, and we are expecting to have 4,000 machine setups this particular year. So we would take and divide that by that 4,000, and that is going to give us $75 per setup. Now again, these are we're trying to figure out what our cost allocation rates are for each activity. So whereas before in the previous under traditional method, we only had one allocation rate, and that was our predetermined overhead rate. For ABC costing, we're going to have one for each activity, but it is found the same way in that we take that estimated overhead divided by whatever our driver amount is. That last one for quality control, the estimated overhead cost is $100,000 for quality control. We're going to be basing this on the number of inspections. So we look at the number of inspections and we expect to have 7,500 inspections. And so what we have here is it's going to be $13.33 per inspection. All right. So this is how we find those cost allocation rates. It's just by simply taking these amounts, dividing by the driver, and coming up with the rates for each activity. We do this at the beginning of the year, and then as the year goes on, we then would be using these cost allocation rates to determine what our overhead is for our individual batches or items. So that's the second problem that you see. We are going to use the following allocations to determine our overhead allocation for batch A. So we have purchasing, and our cost allocation is $20 per purchase order. Receiving is at $5 per shipments received. Machine setup, the allocation rate is at $50 per setup. Quality control is going to be at $10 per inspection. And it tells us what batch A actually uses. So batch A is using 20 purchase orders, 50 shipments, 10 setups, 15 inspections, and it has 50 direct labor hours. So when I get ready to look at what my total overhead for batch A is going to be, now remember this is just for batch A, what we'll look at is for the purchasing part, purchasing activity, it is at $20 per purchase order, and we have 20 purchase orders being used by batch A, so that's $400. When we look at receiving as an activity, it is at $5 per shipment, and it says we have 50 shipments that we are receiving, so that's a total of $250. Machine setup is figured at $50 for each setup we have to do, and it says we have 10 setups with batch A, so that's going to cost us $500. And then we have our quality control, and our quality control is based on $10 per inspection, and we're going to have 15 inspections with this particular batch, and so that's going to rate at $150. So my total overhead cost is going to be taking all of these different activities and adding them together. And so my total overhead cost for batch A is $1,300. Now, I want you to remember this is not my total cost, however. That is just the total overhead cost. When I look at the total cost for an activity, remember that it has direct material, it has direct labor, and it has the overhead. So the overhead is only one component of the total cost. So you want to make sure that if your question is asking you about total cost, that you put that direct material and that direct labor in it. If it wants to know what your gross profit is, you know, what we have to do to find gross profit is you would take what is your sales minus the total cost. So it's not your overhead cost, it's the total cost is what you would be looking at. So just make sure that when you're looking at this, realize that what we've done in this particular problem is we have just found the overhead cost. That is it. And overhead cost is only one component of the total cost. If we remember going back to chapter 19 and chapter 20, as well as chapter 21 and everything, we have direct materials, we have direct labor, and we have overhead, and that is what's going to give us our total cost feature here. So just make sure that you are realizing that. You will have to know all of these particular items as far as working your test for this chapter. You will have to know CVP analysis. You'll have to know high-low method. You're going to have to know your CVP for more than one product, for that sales mix. You're going to have to be able to work problems on activity-based costing, both finding the cost allocation rate and then using that cost allocation rate. And then you also will have to know, okay, what's the total cost for a project and what's the profit or loss for a project. So those are, some of those items that you will be looking at as far as the test is concerned on CVP, on ABC costing, and all of those items for these chapters. There is one other thing that you will have to know as far as the test is concerned, and that is going to be that equivalent units of production. And I will be doing another worksheet on that to try to make sure that you do understand those pieces of information also. But this is the majority of the test, and then the other part will be that coming up with and working your cost production report for the equivalent units of production.